2. On the Fenno threshold a sudden sense of the futility of the attempt had almost driven Mrs. Quinton back to her carriage. But the door was already opening, and a parlour maid who believed that Miss Fenno was in led the way to the depressing drawing-room. It was the kind of room in which no member of the family is likely to be found except after dinner or after death. The chairs and tables looked like poor relations who had repaid their keep by a long career of grudging usefulness. They seemed banded together against intruders in a sullen conspiracy of discomfort. Mrs. Quinton, keenly susceptible to such influences, read failure in every angle of the upholstery. She was incapable of the vulgar error of thinking that Hope Fenno might be induced to marry Alan for his money. But between this assumption and the inference that the girl's imagination might be touched by the finer possibilities of wealth, good taste admitted a distinction. The Fenno furniture, however, presented to such reasoning the obtuseness of its black walnut chamferings, and something in its attitude suggested that its owners would be as uncompromising. The room showed none of the modern attempts at palliation, no apologetic drapings of facts, and Mrs. Quinton, provisionally perched on a green reps Gothic sofa with which it was clearly impossible to establish any closer relations, concluded that, had Mrs. Fenno needed another seat of the same size, she would have set out placidly to match the one on which her visitor now languished. To Mrs. Quinton's fancy, Hope Fenno's opinions, presently imparted in a clear young voice from the opposite angle of the Gothic sofa, partook of the character of their surroundings. The girl's mind was like a large, light, empty place, scantily furnished with a few massive prejudices, not designed to add to anyone's comfort, but too ponderous to be easily moved. Mrs. Quinton's own intelligence, in which its owner, in an artistically shaded half-light, had so long moved amid a delicate complexity of sensations, seemed in comparison suddenly close and crowded, and in taking refuge there from the glare of the young girl's candor, the older woman found herself stumbling in an unwonted obscurity. Her uneasiness resolved itself into a sense of irritation against her listener. Mrs. Quinton knew that the momentary value of any argument lies in the capacity of the mind to which it is addressed, and as her shafts of persuasion spent themselves against Miss Fenno's obduracy, she said to herself that since conduct is governed by emotions rather than ideas, the really strong people are those who mistake their sensations for opinions. Viewed in this light, Miss Fenno was certainly very strong. There was an unmistakable ring of finality in the tone with which she declared, "It's impossible." Mrs. Quinton's answer veiled the least shade of feminine resentment. "I told Alan that, where he had failed, there was no chance of my making an impression." Hope Fenno laid on her visitor's an almost reverential hand. "Dear Mrs. Quinton, it's the impression you make that confirms the impossibility." Mrs. Quinton waited a moment. She was perfectly aware that, where her feelings were concerned, her sense of humor was not to be relied on. "Do I make such an odious impression?" she asked at length, with a smile that seemed to give the girl her choice of two meanings. "You make such a beautiful one. It's too beautiful. It obscures my judgment." Mrs. Quinton looked at her thoughtfully. "Would it be permissible, I wonder, for an older woman to suggest that, at your age, it isn't always a misfortune to have what one calls one's judgment temporarily obscured?" Miss Fenno flushed. "I try not to judge others." "You judge Alan." "Ah, he is not like others," she murmured, with an assent that touched the older woman. "You judge his mother." "I don't. Mrs. Quinton pressed her point. "You judge yourself, then, as you would be in my position, and your verdict condemns me." "How can you think it? It's because I appreciate the difference in our point of view that I find it so difficult to defend myself." "Against what?" "The temptation to imagine that I might be as you are, feeling as I do." Mrs. Quinton rose with a sigh. "My child, in my day love was less subtle." She added after a moment, "Alan is a perfect son." Ah, that again. That makes it worse. Worse? Just as your goodness does, your sweetness, your immense indulgence in letting me discuss things with you in a way that must seem almost an impertinence. Mrs. Quentin's smile was not without irony. You must remember that I do it for Alan. That's what I love you for, the girl instantly returned, and again her tone touched her listener. And yet you're sacrificing him, and to an idea. Isn't it to ideas that all the sacrifices that were worthwhile have been made? One may sacrifice oneself. Miss Fenno's color rose. That's what I'm doing, she said gently. Mrs. Quentin took her hand. I believe you are, she answered. And it isn't true that I speak only for Alan. Perhaps I did when I began, but now I want to plead for you, too, against yourself. She paused, and then went on with a deeper note. I have let you, as you say, speak your mind to me in terms that some women might have resented, because I wanted to show you how little, as the years go on, theories, ideas, abstract conceptions of life weigh against the actual, against the particular way in which life presents itself to us, to women especially. To decide beforehand exactly how one ought to behave in given circumstances is like deciding that one will follow a certain direction in crossing an unexplored country. Afterward we find that we must turn out the obstacles, cross the rivers where they're shallowest, take the tracks that others have beaten, make all sorts of unexpected concessions. Life is made up of compromises. That is what youth refuses to understand. I've lived long enough to doubt whether any real good ever came of sacrificing beautiful facts to even more beautiful theories. Do I seem casuistical? I don't know. There may be losses either way. But the love of the man one loves, of the child one loves, that makes up for everything. She had spoken with a thrill which seemed to communicate itself to the hand her listener had left in hers. Her eyes filled suddenly, but through their dimness she saw the girl's lips shape a last, desperate denial. Don't you see it's because I feel all this that I mustn't, that I can't?